Hello, welcome to another episode of the G.I. Joe New News Review. I am David Allen, and this is part 2 of my deep dive into the impact of the G.I. Joe brand on the comic industry. And I am joined by the editor-in-chief of Devil's Due, Josh Blaylock. Hey, thanks for joining us, Josh. And my co-host, Roger Taft, the author of the After Action Report series of guides.
Oh, no.
Roger, thanks for joining us again.
I was just reading an interview with Josh Blaylock. And hey, Josh, how you doing?
Wow, how convenient.
Was it in the gripping After Action Report?
Yes, absolutely. It's got a lot of information in here about you.
Hope it's not too dirty or too scintillating or secret.
Not salacious, no.
God help us.
Oh, okay.
That's for volume 18.
Oh boy.
That's when they run out of ideas. And then when they really run out of ideas, it takes place in space.
Yeah, and that one's After Action Report After Dark. So
I started this series. The first episode was with Larry Hama, the impact of the G.I. Joe brand of the comic industry, how it the question was whether it saved the comic industry in the 80s or not. And Larry agreed that he felt that it did save the comic industry in the 80s, and that Jim Shooter and the Marvel original Hour Run had a big impact on the comic industry in the 80s due to mail order and so forth, and reprints and things like that, because a lot of comics didn't get reprints, and they weren't very high on the mail order scale, but G.I. Joe is the #1 comic being mail ordered around the world, and had a lot more reprints than most comics.
Quite a few. Yeah.
So the next big era, what was that, Roger?
I just agreed with you. That's all.
The next big era that G.I. Joe came back into the comic book zeitgeist was the late 90s, early 2000s. I'm going to set the stage. At this point in the comic industry, it was very bad. Marvel had been going through chapter 11. The comic industry didn't know what was going to happen because the distribution was all over the place. Diamond had lost a lot of traction from the Heroes World merger with Marvel Comics, and there had been a big push for independent comics. Image Comics had come onto the scene, and a lot of independent comic companies had come onto the scene. So a lot of independent companies were popping up, and they were producing comics through Image Comics for their own brands. Devil's Due was one of these companies that was producing comics with their own brand, and they were able to get the license for the G.I. Joe brand. Now, there was a resurgence at this point in the comic world for 80s nostalgia. G.I. Joe started this tidal wave of 80s nostalgia after it was Thundercats, Masters of the Universe, Gatchaman, Transformers, you name it. Can you give us a snapshot of what the comic industry, from your perspective as an independent comics creator at this point, through Image, Josh, with Devil's Due?
The perspective of like the industry itself, from my viewpoint at the time?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, actually, even more than that, just off my hunch, because I've written about that stuff before. I've gone through and looked at some of those data, some of those charts and the data, and yeah, it was a completely different landscape. Like the bottom, you could see the top 300 comics, and pretty much what their orders were at the time, and the bottom 300 was like hundreds of copies. Like the stores had still not, it had been in recovery from like the whole bust. There was a big bust in like when the Death of Superman came out.
Mhm.
after that, which I think was
That was 91, I believe.
yeah, and then it was in really all the stores. There had been like 10,000 comic book shops or something that had popped up because of the boom that had happened before that, and then thousands of them went out of business. So there, like to this day, there's a couple thousand comic book shops, quote unquote, that that's kind of how it has been for quite a while. But they yeah, that's what I was sort of like went into. Funny enough, I feel like every time I start, like I walk right into the business when it's crashing. Every single thing I've done that when I get ready and geared up to go.
Yeah.
Um, so I started, self-publishing only a couple years after that big crash. But yeah, if you go back and look at the charts, the Marvel had come out of bankruptcy a couple years before that, or were in the process of it, and they had launched their Ultimates line where they were like, you know what, we need to start doing a major marketing campaign and advertise everywhere that this is a new Marvel universe for a whole new audience, and they were doing that. They were doing well with it. But there are only so many people coming into comic book stores, and they really, really pushed it heavily. One of their big initiatives was to push it into all of the newsstand, so you could actually, they were like, you can get comic books at the grocery store again, even though they never really went away. They
Yeah.
they were aggressively pushing that. They may have even played with some different size formats. I'm having a flash. Sounds familiar.
There's
But
definitely a few magazines that showed up that were comic content.
yeah, I think they were on like Good Morning America and everything else. They were like doing everything they could to
Yeah.
push that. But it's still, it worked, but there was only so many people to sell to, and then that started helping bring people in. But the Image Comics was in this period where the sales were not selling what they had been. There were still hits here and there, but I'm sure I can't speak for those guys, but they had been selling millions, and then it went down to thousands. And they had started their Image Central, which was a way for not just the owners of Image, but other creators to come in and publish their own stuff and keep all the rights. And that was like that's what had launched what today still is the crux of Image. And there's a ton of indies around, all kinds, and it was like pretty much like, I wouldn't say the Wild West because it was organized, but it was it was tough. You had to really want to do it. It was harder to print stuff. The computer technology wasn't quite developed as far along yet, so that stuff was still harder. And if you look at the charts of what the top sellers were, I mean, it was like Wizard Magazine was one of the top companies in the top 10. There was some other companies that were not necessarily comic book publishers, but they were considered top 10 in the comic book market. And then you had Marvel and DC and Image and Dark Horse, and their IDW wasn't even really on the map at all. And you had just a handful of others. Manga had really just started to push its way in, and then actually the book I just finished writing called Breaking into Comics, No More Rules. I have a lot of that data, and it's going to be in charts and stuff, and it kind of shows the percentages of market share that everything had back then versus what there is now, and it's just completely different landscape. So comics was hanging in there. People had been through some shit. All the retailers that were there had been surviving and had to be creative and keep it going. And Marvel was starting to do the right things. They also had event comics, so they had or maybe that was even before that, because that was before they put. But that was where they started to kind of like revamp stuff. That was Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada, and then they were able to call in all their homies like Paul Jenkins and other people, and Kevin Smith, started doing stuff, and there was some energy starting to happen, but
It
it
was
just
Marvel
wasn't.
Knights.
Yeah, Marvel Knights. Yeah, DC was doing stuff. It's funny. That's the only time I ever read the Marvel stuff, because I never really was a Marvel kid. except for the G.I. Joe comics and a few other random things.
Yeah.
I read all DC, and I cannot tell you what the hell DC was doing back then. I'm just blanking out on it, but they were there.
It was pretty lackluster until Dark Knight came on.
It was around that time was a big popularity for Alex Ross. He was doing tons of oversized comics,
Kingdom
a lot of
Come
miniseries and covers and stuff. So it was big.
Yeah.
And then you got like Jim Lee had a big push at DC for Wildstorm had come over, and he was doing the Batman Hush stuff, and Long Halloween was popular. But that's just a few things.
Yeah. In the mix in there, Dark Horse had tried to do that G.I. Joe revamp where they
it's
weird.
They didn't exactly hit it out of the park with that one.
Yes. So and I was in there publishing, starting in like 96, black and white, my little black and white comics and fantasy sci-fi stuff.
So
like punk rock indie comics.
What made you think this is the right time to relaunch G.I. Joe?
Well, first off, just as a fan, I mean, since high school, we just like you guys, I'm sure, like, everybody's a nerd for this stuff. It had been gone for years, and you're like, when are they going to bring it back? And then they would try to bring it back, and like, no, when are they going to bring it back and do it right? And then then you're older, and you're like, well, also they should bring it back and do this and that, and make it all badass, and I just, I think what proof of, I don't know, just you had to convince me why it wouldn't work, and you couldn't. It just was crazy to me that wouldn't work. Because I've told this story on, especially like these G.I. Joe podcasts before. I actually in high school, I wanted some, and I haven't told this very often. I wanted some Autobot Decepticon symbol magnets for my car. And it was, I forget how much it cost to make them, but I didn't want to pay for all of it. So I said, how many do I have to make? I think I had to make like 20 of them or something. And I just asked friends, like, who wants to buy the rest of these if I have a couple? And instantly just gone. Everybody wanted them. And then I was working for, I had, been self-publishing comics. I went to like a 2-year art school and had side jobs. And then after my first real job out of school, they laid everybody off. And then I found this little place that was making t-shirts that did some licensed properties, but mostly the Grateful Dead was like their biggest license. And they did other kind of like novelty shirts, and they wanted to do some kind of a retro line. And they were going more along sports jokes and stuff, which I knew nothing about. But I pushed really heavily for like 80s retro cartoon stuff, which they didn't get at the time because it was a brand new concept. And it was the first time people really wanted to wear, our generation was the first that really wanted to like proudly flex our dorky stuff we liked as kids. That had never really been a thing before that much.
Yeah.
That was a childish thing you put behind. And we were like the first ones to be like, what are you talking about? It's just great.
We had Batman in '89. We knew what we were talking about.
Yeah. And that went ahead, and that ended up, I got to be like a business development person. I came in as an art director for hire, really not with no experience, but because I had been doing conventions for 4 years by then, and I had been doing like maybe three years. I just was kind of like thrown into everything. They're like, we're doing a big professional apparel trade show in Las Vegas. You're in charge of setting up the 20 by 10 booth, everything, and then we're going, we started going for licenses, and they were willing to like just let me draw whatever the hell I wanted, and they would make the shirts, and they would like try to get the licenses. And some of them they did get the licenses, some of them they just put out there, and it took off like crazy. And it was in like Hot Topic everywhere, and it was in Gadzooks, which was a huge chain at the time. It was in Spencer's, it was in every single mall store, and it was going pretty heavily online. And they we had, I always got to be there at the trade shows, like 21 years old, seeing how that business is done, and the buyers coming by and placing their orders and everything. And yeah, it was crazy. Like it was a huge phenomenon in that in that like not like high fashion, but like basically the kind of apparel that everyone else in the world buys. Yeah, so that had been going on for like over like a solid year. And I'm seeing everyone, no matter what city I would go to, I'd see people wearing shirts that I designed. I was like, this is great. This is awesome. And then there was going into the comic book shops. So it's like, okay, like everyone working in the comic book shops is wearing these. People, all the customers coming in. This is like, now definitely like we're kind of in our own bubble. So I probably thought, everyone was more cognizantly aware of this than they were. But meanwhile, you're picking up Wizard magazine, which was like what back then that's where everybody got their current news for comic books from Comic Book Buyer's Guide, was dropped off in stores every week. And then they got their like more in-depth interviews and information about creators and what was hot. They got that from Wizard magazine and a couple other magazines. But the Wizard was doing these just like they were spending all this money to have the top artists of the time draw like their fantasy mashup character like covers of unofficial comic books. So like they constantly had J. Scott Campbell in there drawing G.I. Joe and Transformers and Thundercats and He-Man, and they had all these other top artists drawing those. So, and everyone's buying it, constantly talking about it whenever those articles would be out. So this was like a thing that to turn around and have the powers that be just have no clue.
Yeah,
there was all this energy for it. Just kind of broke my brain, and even more so to find out that despite all that, probably like 75% of the retailers also didn't get it. They weren't paying any attention to it either. And it just, again, this was a brand new thing. For some reason, Spider-Man, which you could, if you really looked at it and analyzed it, like in 2000, why was X-Men popular and Spider-Man popular and Batman popular? Because they had TV shows 15, 20 years before that, because they had cartoons,
right?
Going back 25, 30 years before that, they were retro properties.
Right.
They just had never gone away. They had never been phenomenons that came out of nowhere with all this merchandise and marketing and everything, which I know we've talked about before. So with on here. So yeah, like, but it was just, they didn't get like what a big deal this was going to be, and they weren't paying any attention.
Roger, from your perspective, you had several stores, right? You had comic stores and toy stores. Did you see this at the time, the late 90s, early 2000s?
Yeah. As a store owner, I kind of missed it because of the timing. My first store opened when Superman died. It was the same week Superman died. And we closed a month before Marvel Comics went to their own distribution center and completely destroyed the industry. And that's when all those stores closed that Josh was mentioning earlier. And that was about a 3-year period. And then I just did normal stuff in college for like the next 6 years. And I was in college when Devil's Due released its first issue. I don't remember which comic shop I would have bought it at, but I don't think I bought it that week. I think it was maybe a few weeks later. I might not have known about it when it came out. But the thing I did notice in retrospect, my comic shop did have toys as well, but the norm was a comic shop to be a comic shop. But after 2000, 2001, toys and comic shops suddenly were together almost across the board. It was hard to find a comic shop that didn't have toys.
Yeah. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh, you're good. You're good. Go for it.
Oh, we left out. There's a whole huge part of the story which I never talk about. Mm-hmm. I almost don't ever think about anymore. But it's integral to the whole phenomenon back then. Was Toy Biz, and all the explosion of the. McFarlane had really disrupted the toy game by making like the best toys anyone had ever seen. Yeah. And there was all these like in between competitors, like, okay, we're cooler looking than some of the other shitty toys out there, but we're trying to be McFarlane, but we just can't bring ourselves to spend that money on that quality. Yeah. But at a certain point, Toy Biz was Marvel.
Yeah.
Yeah. This company that no one even talks about anymore they really kind
They
of
owned Marvel.
had the comic book industry under
Yeah.
their shadow.
Yeah.
And what they did, and that gets into like a lot of the really skeezy like Wall Street stuff that happened with that guy Ron Perlman, not the actor, that just screwed over Marvel as like a junk bond scam and walked off with $400 million, which at the time the whole industry was worth like $500 million. So basically this one or a couple individuals walked off with like the entire market share of the comic industry in dollar value, and left just the ashes. So there's lots of stores that had all these toys, you know, and they were like had started relying on them, and it's I remember a lot of that stuff vividly, and I was, you know, I look back fondly on the, you know, the whole process and the fun parts of the struggle and meeting everyone and all that and all, but like it was a tough time. Like I don't forget that. Like some people romanticize it more than like I was there, man. Some of those cons were tough, and you know the audience was like way more narrow, and you know the kind of comics that I always wanted to create back then, all these crazy indie books and like stuff like a kind of a punk vibe and fun sci-fi fantasy stuff, like those weren't as popular then either. Like now it's now that's what everyone's buying. So
in the 90s it was all Marvel and Dark Horse, and that was about it.
It's a much broader industry than it was for creative minds and creative styles and imaginations. Way more now than it was back then. It was starting to get there. You could see little things here and there, but it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't as big as it is. So how did you go about getting the license based off all that? How did you get the license for G.I. Joe? And did they like shut the door right in your face right away? Because why do you want this brand? And who are you? And what is it that you want to do with it? Yeah, all these things.
Yeah. So I was like 22, heard I had this weird amount of experience, I think, for someone that made no sense, like to be able to like present myself in a professional way. Comic book wise, I, you know, doing as long as I could. I started when I was 18. I had about 7 issues worth of comic books out that have been nationally distributed, and completed one full miniseries and was working on another one. I had another one coming up and starting to publish other friends' stuff, all black and white books. But then I had this experience of like helping to procure licenses and exhibiting at major trade shows. Meanwhile, I'm going to every little Comic-Con that I can, setting up myself, and I'm meeting people, and you know, like the company I work for was able to get the Ninja Turtles license because I had happened to just be selling my books at a convention in Maryland one weekend, and I got to meet Peter Laird, and I had the contact, and it was like as simple as a phone call, and it just happened. And there was a lot of limbo time too, though, where like there were certain brands where, again, the powers that be did not understand the value, didn't appreciate the value, or they overinflated their value even, and they tried to sell it to other licensees who didn't appreciate the value. You know, I was just sent an email, you know, at my pretty much like half of my apartment was just dedicated to being my office space, and I had a side freelance business too, because I was trying to get out of the job and go full-time doing graphic design and comics. And I emailed them. I think it was as simple as looking up Hasbro's phone number, calling like, hey, who's the licensing department? Can I get an email and stuff to send a proposal to? And I sent that in, and you know, it was just had like my pitch for what I would do, and which actually finally was on display at the I found all those printouts of those old emails, and the pitch was on display at the Assembly Required show last year.
How did they get it? Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. It's now in the hands of Tim Finn.
Oh, Tim Finn.
Yeah. It was up for auction, like a bunch of that stuff.
Wow, interesting.
So we yeah, and they just kind of, to my surprise, they responded like a serious,
Yeah.
email. So and I sent them my comics. Um it's funny, I have heard some little comments before, like that I kind of like tricked them or something. Like I sure as hell didn't mention like, hey, I'm just a kid in an
Gotta
office
step out.
department, because
Yeah.
that
What are
was
we doing
not
today?
Hello, how you doing?
that was not as
The kids.
acceptable back then. But I I mean, I sent them the comic books that I had published, and stuff
Right.
that I had worked on. So I wasn't like hiding any of that, these, like I sent them like black and white comics. But I had my pitch on how I would handle the brand, what I felt like, how I would bring it back, how the story would go, and all that. And yeah, and they responded positively, and we just had a back and forth email exchange, and then they presented these terms to me, which were really egregious, and I said yes. And yeah, it was like a 15% royalty, which is absolutely fucking insane. It's like
Wow.
the highest you ever go is like 10% of the gross wholesale. But I said yes,
You were
and it was like
desperate.
yeah, it was like back then it was like a $30,000 guarantee with a $15,000 upfront, which now sounds like nothing.
Yeah.
But back then that was actually pretty high for license. They literally were just starting to build out the licensing department. Like
Right.
these companies didn't have the same kind of licensing operations that they have now. And they definitely were not experienced or used to like licensing comic books. It was like almost a forgotten thing. And most toy brands didn't, have really many comics anyway. G.I. Joe was this anomaly where the comic books were the whole impetus for it and the life of it. But it was still kind of like that was like known, but not really thought about it anymore. Like that was like ancient history to them at the time. So yeah, we looked like the deal was going to happen, and then it took months for that process to take place. And I went ahead, and I really wanted to leave Cincinnati at the time and move to Chicago. So I knew if this did happen, even though the chances were like 1%, I would be setting up roots here. And so I moved and was waiting it out, and it came through.
So, the way that Diamond and previews and stuff, and the way the comic industry works, is you get like a 3-month preview ahead of time of what's going on, what's happening, and then of course you mentioned Wizard and Hero and Overstreet and all these news fanzines and stuff. Comic News Shop and stuff would announce stuff in advance, so there was a lot of publicity for G.I. Joe. Were you involved in that, or was Image involved in that?
Oh yeah. So they say you should never win the lotto unless you know how you're already going to spend the money. Like if you don't know what you would do with it, you don't. I knew what I was going to do. Like so the plan, and things took more planning then too. Like so. I had been once I knew I was getting it, that the whole game plan started. So I was in contact with James McDonough, who was one of the writers over at Wizard Magazine. Call him up, tell him, confidentially what's going on, get them in place, because they were writing all those articles. I contacted J. Scott Campbell about, would he do a cover? That alone in and of itself, people just look at that cover now and they're like, oh, that was a cool cover. He was a popular artist. I'm like, yeah. And very specifically, I knew he was a fan because of Wizard, but also it was important the fact that he was the artist they were going to the most in Wizard, because Wizard was going to be hyping it up and they're going to be helping engage excitement about it. So it was really key to get J. Scott Campbell. Said, hey, also, I have no money, but you also know this is going to sell. You'll be paid, if you're cool with it, we'll pay you after the fact. And then, fortunately, really just fortuitously met an artist like 30 years my senior at the time, David Beck, who was this amazing painter in Cincinnati, a commercial artist who had done a lot of billboard paintings and art like that, but he was also did his own fine art on the side. He painted that first iconic Snake Eyes cover, the back cover to issue number 1, which was probably one of the most realistic looking Snake Eyes as anyone, we had ever gotten to see. It felt like a movie poster, and one could argue it inspired the movie poster later. But I was like starting to get on the message boards to see that excitement.
Yeah, like
And then-
yojo.com and so on.
Yeah, so all this stuff was lined up. And then I secured the deal with Image Comics to publish it, which I didn't realize at the time. Like, I idolized those guys growing up and thought, like, I just dreamed like how they had this cool studio and they did all their books, and to be published by them was awesome. What I kind of didn't realize at the time was that centralized new kind of operation they had was really meant just to publish creators stuff, not a whole new studio operation that was like going to want to move as fast and go up as fast as we did. But fortunately, they said yes. So then they were able to set up, like, making sure we had issue 1 to give away at the retailer summit, and they were the reason why we got, I don't think they planned it. They definitely didn't plan for it to take off like it did and be so big. They didn't also understand that it was going to be that popular, but they thought it was worth taking a chance on. And we ended up being like the cover to Previews magazine.
Yeah,
the catalog that went to all the retailers. Like, it was the number one. You could only get 2 covers front and back on Previews magazine every month that every comic shop sees when they order that catalog. And it was on the front, or it was on the back cover. And then the Wizard, everything worked out, so all the dominoes started to fall. Wizard was talking about it. Campbell was announced. We dropped the David Michael Beck painting on the message boards, and people lost their shit. Like, just, it was so cool looking, and everyone got really excited. So people are calling their retailers on the phone and going in there every Wednesday, like, have you heard G.I. Joe's coming back? Oh my God. And, and the retailers are like, the 75% probably that we're still not getting it. We're like, okay, cool. But they were forced to all of a sudden be like, oh crap, I better pre-order a lot of these.
Yeah.
And then of course the other 25% that did get it, was a no-brainer. Then I think, to add to that hype, I think it was before our book came out. But while the hype was in there, Dreamwave secured the rights to Transformers. Right. So now you had all this energy of, like, to double check my dates on that, but you had this energy of the hype that had already started. Now is the gasoline was whatever the fire was being flamed.
So from the fans' perspective at the time, I was like, holy crap, they're bringing G.I. Joe back. It's going to continue where Larry's series left off, is what a lot of the articles and different news things was saying. They're going to introduce some cool new modern artists and some new characters and things like that. And I was really excited for it because I was a huge G.I. Joe Comics fan. That's where I got into G.I. Joe, is from the comics and stuff like that. And I was very, very glad that it was happening. Did you get a lot of news, a lot of like that not tension, but that excitement from the fan base? Was were you getting emails, news, letters, and so on and so forth?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, that was it was just constant bombardment. Everyone was super pumped, and that's why when I would encounter someone who was just, you could tell they just didn't get it. It was like, all right, that's fine. Not being upset with them or even cocky about it either. It was just like this, you just don't know. I'm sorry, like, talk to me in like 3 months. And it was funny too, because I set up, I think it was like Detroit. I set up at a convention and I didn't have anything yet, but I mean, I knew the momentum behind it. So I had some of my black and white comics, and a little bit of, like, I had some of the preview flyers and stuff we made for the show, and I had 2 little American flags I put up on the table, and that was like my my display. And I remember people commenting later, like, "Oh, I remember you just had that little display, did you, like like I." And that's what's funny, is like, it's it's just like, I don't know. not trying to like put on airs about it, but also you just have the certainty and like it's going to be
Yeah.
a big deal.
Right.
And
What were the sales, if you don't mind me asking?
so the pre-orders came in, it's like 69,000 copies, was before it hit. So then, and that always sticks in my head, not just because that was such a big deal at the time for me, but well, also we did one thing I did because we had like no money was in that this is where Image really helped too. I found out they would print a preview. So the Image deal is they take $2,500 to this day. They take a $2,500 flat fee. So no matter what you sell, that's what they take. If you sell 5 copies or 500,000 copies, they take that. For me, for some reason, they charge $3,000, which I've never seen that anywhere else.
Wow.
But they charged me $3,000. They made me do a bi-monthly schedule because he didn't like trust that I was gonna put this book out monthly because everyone else they did was late all the time, even though I was like, no way in hell I'm gonna be late with this book.
Yeah.
But I found out they would do a preview comic or a convention special or something, and they would print that, and they would just lump that into the marketing costs for the first issue. So all you had to worry about was printing. I was like, oh, sweet. I think it was like 2 days. I start to finish did that G.I. Joe convention special from scratch. Got that ready, sent it off to the printer, and we got it in time for San Diego Comic-Con. And then that sold enough. And then I was able to start taking pre-orders. Like before crowdfunding, I was taking like pre-order crowdfunded subscriptions just on a website and keeping track of them on a piece of paper. And yeah, but it was because it wasn't an accident. It was a very specific plan of like how to make this work and writing the momentum, timing it right, and just getting everyone fomenting like for its release. And that's where like Hasbro had no clue, like they did not appreciate any of that. No awareness of like the thought that was going into that. So it was just like, it was more like, oh fuck, who's this kid that has our license? Because all they saw was, wait a minute, people are talking about this. Like we're getting phone calls, people asking about it. We're getting probably like press interview questions. Like, what's going on here? Oh no, what have we done? And then it hit the 69,000 copy pre-orders. But I remember I had to argue with the publisher, like, well, you're going to need to print 100,000. Mm-hmm. And it was like, oh, are you out of your mind? Like, what do you know, 100,000 copies? And I said, well, at the end of the day, we know we've got 70,000 sales. You're taking out the $2,500. It's my bottom line, right?
Yeah.
If it's, and they're like, yeah. I said, okay, well, then can we do 100,000? Yeah. And they're like, okay, fine. And then we sold out like instantly, so then so that answers that question. But there was that's the whole like thing leading up to like all the right dominoes falling into place. Do
you remember what kind of numbers that compared to a regular issue? I mean, the stuff that was already popular at the time.
I mean, like it was back. It was like I think Batman, X-Men stuff were like 100,000 copies.
Okay.
The top books like on average, like because people used to write about it all the time, like how concerned they were, like, oh, the top selling books are X-Men. Uncanny X-Men is 100,000 copies. Batman's 98,000 copies. And 5 years ago, we would cancel a book if it only sold 90.
Yeah.
And times have changed.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but then there would be an anomaly. Some big event thing would happen, and it would go up. Yeah. To well, now the standards will still be like around 100, but then you'll have like Absolute Batman sells 400,000 copies or something crazy like that. Right. But then it was like, okay, yay, it sold 150. And the month G.I. Joe came out, there was it's funny because I'm friends with Paul Jenkins now, but he had the one book like the Wolverine Origins came out.
Oh yeah.
It was such a big deal. So I think pre-orders were 150, and Diamond, all of the public numbers came from like Diamond releasing what they were, and back then they only released the pre-orders until just before COVID when we lost all this data. For years, I think it was about 10 years ago, they started releasing it the sell-through numbers.
Yeah.
So if you had looked at the chart, this is really nerdy stuff. Like if you had looked at the charts,
You want?
I'm pretty confident G.I. Joe would have been the number 2 comic book in the country that month.
Yeah.
And it would have been number 1 if it was not for
Origins.
Origins.
Yeah.
Because then we went into doing because it just, there might have been a little more than 100,000 printed. I can't remember exactly. We also gave away a bunch at the Retailer Summit. That had been like a few months before that.
I've been ordering my comics from online for probably more than 25 years. Since the late 90s I've been ordering online comics, and I have local LCSs that I go to that I'm very close to them and stuff, but it's cheaper for me to buy my comics online. But I would go to these local LCS and they were all sold out. They were like, yeah, we ordered this many, we sold out. We ordered this many, we sold out. So there was none really to be had in my local area. This is Central Florida. I've been in Central Florida since 91. And so it was a huge thing. All the people that I knew that were into G.I. Joe got it and loved it and stuff like that. And it was definitely a different style of comic than previous G.I. Joe comics, Larry Hama series, and so on. Was that intentional on your part?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, you're right. Like they were sold out, and it was that's that percentage that they got it. They maybe didn't quite get the demand, and then they realized like, oh shit, I better up my orders. But again, there had never been anything like this before, so that leads into why, which could be a whole other podcast, like why Transformers #1 did so well, because not only did it kind of the announcement come out when all the hype was happening that the deal was done, by the time we had sold through all 100,000 copies, and then we sold through another 25,000 copies of the second printing and then combined issues 1 and 2 together and sold through that, it's like, okay, now and then there were announcements that other 80s things were getting snatched up, and I think there was like, okay, we're not getting caught with our pants down this time. And I think they sold through 200,000 copies of Transformers #1. Well, they got pre-orders for that. And I think they ended up selling over 300,000 copies of the first issue. So it was when Wolverine Origins is selling 150, and Transformers is selling 300. It's like, okay, this is do you guys get it now?
Yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, in that mix was Hasbro being which didn't understand that my thing was planned and methodical. We're like, well, you only sold 100,000 copies.
But you were also the first.
I've spoken with Daryl DePriest. Daryl DePriest was the head of the brand at that point, and he admits he was not on board, and he did not have his pulse on the industry at the time, the comic industry, and didn't get it. He did want to pair with you guys when you were coming up with new characters so they could include it, so they could somewhat be in synergy with you. But he admitted that he was not on board and he did not get it at that point. And he was head of the brand, and Hasbro was in the same boat as him. They didn't get it. They wish they had, in hindsight, they wish they had more synergy with you guys, but nobody knew this was going to happen. Just like the original G.I. Joe, Real American Hero. No one knew that all the stuff that happened with that was going to happen.
Only the 100,000 fans, the 100,000 fans out there knew what was going to happen, but it's always it had to do with the dysfunctionality of the licensing department there. The old regime there was just run by a monster, and just not a good vibe, and so there was just a lot of toxicity going on there. And so if you were trying to coordinate between licensing and then the toy department, and then so Daryl was in a whole different spot where he's the brand kind of overlooking at all of it, but the licensing, and traditionally you're running a brand. I've never actually worked in that role, but so take this with a grain of salt. But when you're running the brand, You're like, okay, I'm overseeing the toys and cartoons and stuff. Okay, and then there's licensing. All right, yeah, underwear and school erasers and lunch boxes and comics and blankets. It's like this thing where the comic book is such a dominant driving force in the whole brand, and fantasy was not really understood yet. But anyway, digressing like crazy. So I felt very specific as part of this whole rollout. The comic had to be brought back in a certain way. You had to have certain characters that also appealed to the masses that kind of more casually read the comic books, who watched the cartoon, whose memories are more locked in the cartoon, but they did read the comics, or more importantly, they're currently reading comic books too. And then so I was going with the comic book continuity, but the
cartoon cast,
the art, the coloring, everything had to look more modern, more like a modern like image book. And then I kind of, the way I would write it was, it's the continuity, but definitely like I'm hearing a lot of those cartoon voices in my head. So like, even though it's Destro is Arthur Burghardt and Shipwreck, is from the cartoon, and even, so that stuff carried over. In just really also just pitching the concept, right, that people could easily talk about and get excited about, like, oh, they've been gone for 7 years, they're back because Cobra Commander's back on soil. Let's go.
So then the question I asked at the beginning of this was the impact that the G.I. Joe brand had on the comic industry. And Roger, I'd like to hear your part in this as well, because you're coming from another perspective as well. Do you feel that the G.I. Joe Devil's Due series helped reinvigorate the comic industry at the time and lit a flame under it and brought a lot more fans into comic stores and a lot more eyes on the comic industry to help a lot of this other stuff? Hey, I'm coming for G.I. Joe, but let me see if Superman's good right now. Let me see if Wolverine's good right now. Or let me see if Green Lantern's good right now. That type of attitude. Do you think it had that kind of an impact? And if it did, how does that affect you, that you basically helped save the industry at that point?
Yeah, Roger did it. What?
Oh, I totally have so much support.
It's a funny time to be like, not at all.
No. Well, from my point of view, like I said, I was out of the comic business at the time. I wasn't selling comics, but I never stopped going to comic shops. But in like 99, 2000, I was not getting nearly as much as I had. And then that brought me back a little more so. But my personal arc was through about 2005 or so. I was going hardcore from Devil's Due 1 through about 2005. I was buying a lot of comics. I was getting, $200-$300 worth of comics every month. Oh. And then after 2005, 2006 or so, I just got tired of everything except G.I. Joe. And I kept keeping the G.I. Joe subscriptions and make like 3 others and dropped everything else. So it definitely brought me more into it. Not that I had ever left, but I was getting a lot more stuff because of it, I think. So. And
what were your perspective, Josh? Do you feel that helped the comic industry overall and really put a fire under the comic industry and brought a lot more eyes and a lot more people into this fandom?
Yeah, it's really hard to answer that question and not just be super biased. But I mean, I try to look at it objectively. I think 100%. I think it's the one thing like that is one of those things that happened in comic book history that really isn't really talked about much. I think I like to think we helped, because I think it was because of all of those things we talked about before coming into place, where if Palmiotti and Quesada had not come in and started tinkering around with Marvel in the mid 90s, and then Quesada and Gemmis taking over after that, doing all kinds of experimental stuff, and the Ultimates line launching and all these collections being out and all these other companies doing what they were doing, then I think just from like I've probably personally had people tell me and shake my hand over 20 years, probably 1,000 people literally say, man, G.I. Joe got me back into comics. Or like, when your books came out, that got me back into comics. I've heard it over and over and over and over again. Every time I do a show to this day, there's somebody that comes up and says that. And they all say, I hadn't read in a few years and I heard that was coming back and I had to pick it up. And so, I mean, I think it's probably, there's just no real data, but it was probably, if we sold 100,000 copies, even if some of those are duplicates, let's say 75,000 unique individuals bought the book. It's probably a good chance that we brought in 30 to 50,000 people who had not been reading comics that actively before. Maybe maybe a portion of them had pull boxes, but they weren't in all the time. And then collectively, just also knowing, it was kind of like picking up G.I. Joe and then knowing also or a retailer being able to inform you Transformers is coming back and they're talking about the other stuff. And you kind of have been like, this is my shit. I've been waiting for all this to come back. So that kept you coming back to the store. And then it all started with the Joe stuff.
Yeah.
And but then you're like, oh, I didn't know there was a whole new Spider-Man. Or I heard about that Spider-Man reboot on the news, but I haven't got a chance to pick it up yet. And it had been around long enough for there to be all these collected editions. And so people got, they got bit by the comic bug again. And then there's a lot of people, honestly, that might have got sick of the 80s stuff after a few years and stayed and kept reading all the Marvel stuff or DC stuff,
right,
or all the Image books that had been coming out. But 100%, just it's kind of funny, like you guys had talked about in a previous episode with Larry, how Joe really helped bring all these new faces into the comics world. And then I think back then, the funny thing was, it was really G.I. Joe was the comic book cartoon phenomenon that is so seriously such a long running comic. Transformers second runner, everything else was kind of treated more like a license. It might have gone on for a while, but not that big of a deal. The second time around, the 80s stuff collectively, I think, brought everybody back in, which was started by our resurgence of G.I. Joe. And then later also we did Voltron. So that was part of the whole picture. And then you've got all that stuff happening. And then, that segued into the manga explosion was starting to happen. And then the movies were starting, the Marvel universe was in its formation. And around, so we, this is the end of 2001. Then 2000 and in the mid, right around 2004 or 5 is when bookstores, because of manga, a lot of it being such a fast growing category, getting really nerdy into the business side of it now. The librarians and school librarians and bookstore graphic novel buyers, bookstore buyers, all of a sudden started embracing graphic novels.
Yeah.
Just because the money, it was the fastest growing category in all of books and of all categories. So that, and then so it's kind of never, there was always something that kept it going. And, it's hard to argue that the 80s resurgence didn't give it all a big shot in the arm that, snowballed into other things.
And it seems like that is a recurring theme. That's why I thought doing this series was very important, to talk about these things, to get this stuff out there so people understand the mindset of the fans, the mindset of the industry professionals like yourself, the mindset of where the world was at that point in the comic industry, and how this brand has saved it, in my opinion, 3 times. And we're going to go into the third part on the next part of this series down the road. But for now, I really want to say thank you to Josh Blaylock for giving us this hour of his time, his busy schedule, because he's got lots of projects going on. Is there anything that you would like to pitch right now that you've got coming out? How's your Kickstarters doing and things like that?
We're working on multiple things at once. Mostly, like, I'm working on a lot of my own personal like projects now. But the next Mercy Sparks series, if you're into, actually, I just sort of have not done a big active push for yet, but kind of softly launched a new tagline, which is "Fearless, Unfiltered Stories for Those Who Dare to Indulge." And we, especially, Devils Do really like hones in on stories of like high concept action, sci-fi, supernatural. That's my jam. And where the next Mercy Sparks miniseries comes out next year. There's a lot of announcements going on right now about the distribution and publishing side that are more like the business stuff again. That's kind of like been the focus. Yeah, check us out. DevilsDo.net. All the stuff's there.
Cool.
And then we didn't even talk about the Disavowed. Oh my god, duh.
Yeah, your Kickstarter.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, but I didn't want to pressure.
One book I'm doing with another publisher, so I'm a little bit at their mercy of when they do stuff. And there's been so many things happening in the industry on the distribution side and everything. It's all just about sorted. 2 issues of the Disavowed have been like drawn, inked, lettered, almost all colored. Issue 3 is being drawn. I'm working on issue 4. It's like, if you love G.I. Joe and you like all this stuff we've just been talking about, but like the idea of it being that there was a team like this that existed in the past, and sort of like the events that happened back then are affecting what happens today, and somebody's getting sucked into it now. And also is very, very much more like hardcore, like crazy. You kind of call it G.I. Joe meets the boys. Is how they're marketing it, but it's really it's a love letter to all kind of crazy 80s action films, martial arts films, and the wacky sci-fi of all the 80s cartoons we grew up with.
Absolutely.
Roger, would you like to add anything?
I read the first Disavowed. It's fun. I think you should go check it out if you're a G.I. Joe fan. So, yeah.
How
You can take out my sniper rifle right now.
How can the fans reach you, Roger?
Facebook's easiest. You can either reach out to us at the After Action Report G.I. Joe Comic Guides Facebook page, or just Roger Taft on Facebook.
Great. So again, I really appreciate you guys helping me take this deep dive into this topic that's been very passionate for me. I've talked to Josh at different conventions, and Roger, I've been bending his ear for years about this, trying to find a hook to this topic to make it entertaining, because I think it is very important that the fans of today know what's going on about the past, because we don't have fanzines like we did. We don't have Hero. We don't have Overstreet. We don't have Wizard. We don't have those type of magazines anymore that we can talk to these people. So YouTube is the place that we can nostalgically look back, kind of like the new 80s nostalgia, where where fans are kind of getting people and talking about this stuff. So I want to say thanks again for joining me. Fans out there that are watching, if you would like to see a lot more gripping interviews and deep dives, like, share, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you next time. Yo, Joe!
Go back!